Welcome to Minds Between Languages. In this episode, we talk to Sharon O'Brien from Dublin City University about augmented cognition in translation. Welcome to Minds Between Languages. Our topic today will be augmented translation, and I'm very happy to be joined by Sharon O'Brien. Sharon, hello.
Hi, hello, how are you?
Not too bad. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. Let's start with the concept of augmented cognition. It can be defined in different ways. So which definition would resonate most for you, considering its application to translation?
Yes, thank you for that. I have looked at a few different definitions of augmented cognition, basically because I have seen that this concept is starting to make its way into discussions about translation, especially in the world of enterprise and the commercial world. So I was curious to know, what did they mean by augmentation, in particular in relation to translation. So this led me to look at various definitions of augmented cognition to see if what companies who were talking about augmented translation, if that's what they actually meant, or did they mean something else. So the seminal definition for augmented cognition really is attributed to Engelbart all the way back in the 1960s, who was looking at this from almost a military perspective, I think, in the US government. And his concept of augmentation is where we are able as human beings to solve complex problems faster, that we can get to solutions much faster and to better solutions via augmentation. And the type of augmentation, of course, at the time maybe was limited, but generally here we're talking about tools that we can use that will overcome our limited abilities in terms of cognition. So I think that definition is probably a useful one that can be applied in the area of translation as well. Mm-hmm. There are other definitions that are used, or other concepts which actually go in the direction of physical augmentation as well. Right. And that's not really something that I think is very applicable in the area of translation. So this concept of being able to do cognitive tasks of a complex nature faster and with better solutions via some sort of tools and technology that help us overcome our own limited cognition is the concept of augmentation that I think would be very useful for our field.
Right, because what kind of definition you take, it also has some consequences on how this will play out in the real world. You talk in your recent research about augmentation as emulation versus empowerment.
Exactly.
Perhaps you can clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, so in the recent paper that I wrote on this, which was published in Perspectives, I'm drawing quite heavily on a scholar called Ben Schneiderman. And Ben Schneiderman talks a lot about human-centered artificial intelligence, where he is arguing that we need to be focusing more on amplifying human intelligence and empowering humans to do more cognitively, rather than emulating human intelligence. And I thought this was really, really interesting, because for me, in a way, when we look at machine translation and how it has developed, I think largely it's been driven by emulation. So let's take what human translators have done and let's learn through machine learning and try to emulate that translation. And I think this perhaps has led to that friction maybe between human translators and machine translation.
And the fear of being replaced by
Exactly, because if
technology.
something's emulating your abilities, then it can, of course, replace you.
Mm.
Whereas I really like Schneiderman's his stance on the AI situation, which is let's not go in that direction, but rather let's look at intelligence amplification, so IA through AI. And that sort of appealed to me quite substantially. I think, I thought, oh yeah, this is maybe, this could help with the friction that we notice between professional translation and machine translation development.
Right. I think we can come back to this also human-centeredness of technology a little bit later.
Okay.
But before we do that, I just wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think that translation, professional translation in particular, is already augmented? Or is it fully augmented? Is it just partially augmented?
Yeah.
It has been for some time, right? But
Yeah, a really good question. Again, I was curious about the industry commentaries on this, which was presenting augmented translation as a kind of a new thing. And I stopped to think about that. I was like, really, is translation not already in some ways augmented? And of course, then, as you said, it really depends on the definition that you take for augmentation. But if we go back to Engelbart's definition of, using tools and technology to help us solve complex problems faster and better, then actually, I think we could argue that translation has been augmented for quite some time. And I go back to my days as a student translator. So we had to carry large dictionaries with us around from home up to the university and back again. We would have to go to the library for the very specialized dictionaries. And we were instructed to create terminology collections on index cards. Now, I'm showing my age, of course, by revealing all of that.
I sympathize because I remember those as well.
Yes, I see.
Well.
I see you nodding. Yes, yes. So, but that was the reality just a few decades ago. And since then, we now have tools where we have much more access, easier access to specialized terminology collections, to databases of previous translation and so on. So I think that these arguably have allowed us to solve the complex problems of translation faster and better than when we were walking around with large dictionaries and index cards. So on the one hand, I would say that translation is already augmented via Engelbart's concept of the idea of augmentation. However, as we all know, these tools have also introduced new problems. So it's not that they have absolutely augmented the act of translation without any issue whatsoever. They've introduced problems such as, technical difficulties, that if your CAT tool crashes, of course, that's going to interrupt your cognitive flow. We've talked about user interfaces not being really ideal for translation. We've talked about how CAT tools maybe force you to look at smaller units of text rather than whole text. So they've introduced new problems, perhaps. So I would say, of course, the act has been augmented, but we've also got new issues that we have to deal with, which impact on the cognitive process of translation as well.
Yes, and we can somehow envision more or further augmentation, right? As you give some ideas in your recent work about these amplifications, further amplifications that could be introduced,
right?
With the human translator being helped by technology rather than
exactly.
being
So in my work on this, I did some reading about, how do other fields or cognitive scientists see augmented cognition? And what they envisage is goes way beyond what we have in CAT tools, for example. With that in mind, we could say that translation could be augmented further conceptually at least. Now, how that might happen technically is quite a challenge. But the idea here is that we can use sensors, to like eye tracking, like galvanic skin response, ECG, EEG, all of these kinds of sensors to detect when a human being's cognitive state is in such a place that it requires some assistance. So, these things can detect whether you are confused, feeling a bit stressed, and so on. So these sensors could be used in an augmented cognition system to theoretically assist with translation. Now, this sounds very maybe, futuristic, but as we've seen, technology has developed very, very quickly in the last number of years. And I think we already have some of these sensors built into our laptops. So right now we're using a camera to talk to each other. These cameras could be used to detect cognitive state through pupil dilation, through eye tracking, for example. We have trackpads and keyboards that now read our fingerprints and so on. So it's not inconceivable that we could have sensors built into our small laptops that would be able to at least theoretically detect a cognitive state that could then be linked with a system that has mitigations. So when this particular state is detected, then this action should occur to assist with the cognitive demand. So I think that from a futuristic perspective, there's probably a lot more that could be done theoretically, but I do understand and emphasize actually that these kind of systems and implementing them in an effective way, that's very, very challenging.
Right, but if we think that technology is actually getting smaller, gadgets are getting smaller and smaller, they can possibly get even smaller. There could be some ways, if I understood you correctly, for instance, sensor might detect that you're looking at a word for a longer time, or that your pupils are dilated, so indicating some kind of cognitive effort that is increased. So meaning perhaps the translator doesn't know this term, and then offer through some perhaps eyewear, some solutions so that you don't have to even click or go looking for it, for example, things like that, right?
Exactly. So that's the idea, that, as I say, maybe implementing it is difficult. But for now, but I imagine that this would be possible in the near future.
Right.
So that's it, exactly. And even, if you think about what we wear, some of us at least these days, on our wrists, we already have biological trackers, which could, feed into a system that detects your confusion, maybe you're tired, and the system can then be programmed to react in a specific way. So as the example you gave is perfect. So if I'm staring at a word for a long time, it's possible that I'm confused by the word, I don't understand it. And so the system could then be programmed to react in a particular way. So that would be, I think, taking augmented translation into the future, above and beyond what we have at the moment.
Right, that would be like full augmentation rather than just a buzzword, right?
Yes, exactly.
I'm also interested in the kind of ethical challenges that this may present, and what will all this mean for translators?
Yeah. So I think that the ethics behind this are really, really interesting, and I suppose they're tied up quite a lot with the general discussion of the ethics of AI, but focusing on maybe a system that detects cognitive states while translating, the first question that comes to mind is who has access to that data? Yeah. And how would that data be used? So if you're a translator who works in-house for a company and they're tracking your cognitive state, there are all sorts of ethical implications there. If, for example, it's demonstrated that you're always really tired first thing in the morning, or, after 3:00 in the afternoon, you're not very productive. So there are huge ethical questions there. That's the first one. The other is, one of the questions that we've dealt with in translation studies for quite some time is, this drive to be more productive. And what does that do to people? So on the one hand, a system like this could be very beneficial. It could, if it was implemented in a way that suited the individual, could help with productivity, it could help with creativity. It could mean you might get more work done and then have the afternoon off, for example. So maybe life gets better.
Right.
Yeah, but on the other hand, this idea of being monitored and a system recording your biological and your cognitive data has, as you say, many perils potentially attached to it. The other issues are perhaps this kind of a system, costs a lot of money. So maybe only those who have money can actually pay for it. That's one thing. But in the paper, I also flip that over and talk about maybe it's not desirable to be monitored in this way, and actually to unplug yourself, perhaps you have to pay. This is maybe something that will happen in the future, that you need to pay to not be monitored, to like detach yourself from all the data that is being accumulated about us on a daily basis. So there are lots of potentially very thorny ethical questions that come up here. I think that's going to have, it's going to require a lot of discussion and thinking into the future, not just about translation and systems that deal with translation, but other kinds of systems as well that might implement this technology.
Yeah, I think in many ways translation can be used as a kind of case in point, as an illustrative case for all other technology, because it has been somehow under the influence of neural networks and also all of this for quite some time. So we can study translation to see how other professions might also be affected and other types of human activities. But you're right, this drive for more and more productivity is, the tools are developed in order to help humans, but as soon as they become widespread and widely used, then this raises the bar and more productivity is expected. So you can never really win.
Yeah, no, it's such an interesting question because, if we bring it out to the more generic discussions about AI and replacement of jobs and so on and so forth, some of the arguments put forward are that AI will free us up to have more free time, to, enjoy life more. If that were really true and we were still earning the same amount of money or more money, ideally, then that would be great. But actually what we've seen is that as the tools become more intelligent, humans, at least in the field of translation, are expected to do more for less money. So the reality has not been the kind of nice idea of work in the morning and take the afternoon off.
But let's get back to this notion of human-centeredness. So if we imagine for a moment that technology really were human-centered rather than profit-driven, what would happen? I mean, to what extent do you think that current technology, translation technology, is human-centered? You have already mentioned some issues earlier, but if this was different, how could this empower translators? What changes would need to happen?
Yeah, so again, I suppose a lot of the literature that we've written in the field would point to the fact that we don't believe that the technology development has been in the direction of human-centered technology at all. As you say, it's been driven by commercial interests and interests in increasing productivity and so on. This has played out in criticisms of tools and how they've been designed, and sometimes in the early days their instability, forcing translators to work in a particular way, so on strings of text rather than actual full narrative text, let's say. I think it's fair to say that the development of translation technology has not really been human-centered from the point of view of the translator. Translators have rarely been involved in design of tools, in testing of them as they're being developed. They are basically developed sometimes by people who are maybe previously translators turned developers, or they know many languages and so on. So they are trying to produce tools that really work for translation, but maybe not for translators. So I think human-centered would require actual end users to be involved in the design, the development, the testing of tools before they're launched on the market. And then, feedback, I suppose, once tools are launched. So implementing changes to tools to suit the end users, in this case, translators. Machine translation, I think, again, hasn't really been human-centered from the point of view of serving a translator. But you could argue it is human-centered from the point of view of making translation and information more available to people around the world. So I think it really depends on what way you look at it. But if you're looking at it from a technology perspective, I don't think that we have had a very human-centered translation tool development landscape in the past.
Yes, and this has had an impact on how people interact with technology, right? Because as you said, if you have small segments of text and not enough context, it's a different way of working than if you work in an ordinary environment that people are used to, where you can see the whole text. I think you have yourself done some work with interactive machine translation rather than just post-editing.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, we're working on that. I have a PhD student who's working on that at the moment, and interactive post-editing, I think, the technology is really starting to emerge now. And the question is that, more human-centered, because you're more in control of what's happening in the system. You're making decisions as in real time, rather than being presented with a translation which could be good, maybe mediocre, maybe really bad, and then you have to fix it. So there are definitely tools that are emerging that might be more human-centered. One thing that I would say is that if we go back to augmentation, that the literature there suggests that actually the mitigations that might be implemented for augmented cognition are quite individualistic. So what works for one person, whether that's like source text here and target text here, or side by side, there might be differences. So one person might prefer one over the other. And these augmented systems really need to be tuned on an individual. Now, to me, that sounds very human-centered because it's focusing specifically on a particular individual, their cognitive states, and what kind of assistance they might require in certain circumstances, which ideally the human would be in control of. You would say, well, when you notice that I seem to be getting tired according to these particular indicators, please, pop a message up that says you need to take a 15-minute break now. A bit like my watch tells me, you've been sitting for too long now. And I'm like, oh yeah, okay. But
but of course, this would make the technology even more expensive. So yeah.
Of course. And getting these individual tunings is probably the word to use there. That's, very challenging from a scientific and a technical perspective. So I know that, people might say, oh, that's so far-fetched, but I think, it won't be long before we see this kind of thing happening in different fields. So why not translation?
Sure, yeah. And also because sometimes people say that technology, especially machine translation, blocks translators' creativity. So I think if it was done presented or implemented in a different way than it is right now, then perhaps it could be used to foster or stimulate people's creativity rather than block it.
Yeah, and the creativity question is a really interesting one, because I have heard some people saying, well, actually, I find machine translation quite useful, because even though it might present me with something that's wrong or not usable, it initiates an alternative idea for me. So it kind of primes you to find alternatives, which is a creative process to some extent. So different people react in different ways to machine translation. So again, it would be down to the individual to say, well, how much of that do I want to use? Or, maybe show me machine translation when you detect that I'm struggling with something, turn it on, turn it off, have it on in the morning, off in the afternoon, vice versa. So this personalization of the system, I think is a nice idea.
And it would lead to the idea of IA rather than AI that you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. And a system that is serving you rather than you serving the system.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Sharon. Is there anything that translator education can do? As a translator trainer, I'm interested always in this, to help move things in the right direction. So how can we teach future translators to work in these augmented environments that we can sort of predict, but which we still don't know what they will look like? And also, how can we help them to shape these environments in future to suit them better and to move things in the right direction? Is there anything that we can do as translator trainers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we've struggled with that for many years as the technology has grown. But I mean, I think we are much better these days at ensuring that students of translation are familiar with the tools, that they are not just learning how to use them, but also to how to critically evaluate them. And I think we've become much better with that. I think we've also become much better at overcoming the fear of, in particular, machine translation, this resistance to it because it's going to replace me. At least that's my sense. I know that sometimes I say these things and other people will say, oh no, not in my world. So I suppose I'm speaking about this just from my point of view. So I do believe we've become much better, and we should keep doing that. We should keep ensuring that students of translation are not afraid of the technology, that they know how to use it to their advantage, but they also do that with a critical perspective. Well, is that enough for the future? That's a question on my mind. Ideally, I think we should be training people to also be collaborative developers of these tools.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I'm not necessarily saying they have to become programmers or designers or, HCI specialists, but how do we give them the confidence to go to a company that's developing technology and say, you need me, I'm your end user, and here's what I can offer you, so that they have confidence to say, I have something to add here to your development process, and you actually really need me to be on board. So I would love to see more and more, linguists, translators being collaborators with companies, and for companies to realize that actually you need this diversity in your development team to ensure that the technology is suitable, fit for purpose, acceptable to its end user, but also coming back to the ethical dimension, that you've thought about all of the potential ethical ramifications and tried to, deal with those as best you can. So how do we get there? I actually don't really know. But I want to come back to one thing that you said earlier, which is using translation as a sort of an example area. And this has been quite interesting for me in the last year since ChatGPT was launched. In our university environments, there was a sudden awakening to AI and what it was going to do, in particular in educational circumstances. And I thought it was very interesting because in translation studies, we were shrugging our shoulders going, oh yeah, I've been with this for a long time. Let me tell you what we do. Whereas the threat, in inverted commas, was very new to other areas like education studies, to literary studies, to programming. So this was interesting that we could say, yeah, we've been dealing with this for a long time. Look at us as a case study for how we've tried to deal with the integration of AI, both in the professional field and the educational field. So I think we have something to offer there. But that's a little aside, I suppose.
No, I agree. Absolutely. I agree. And also the fact that these tools have to be somehow integrated in processes, in teaching, in the classes, rather than just some kind of add-on. They will learn about this later when they start working.
Yeah.
But these are not just tools. They have such a profound impact on human cognition, right? That it's not just something that, okay, to be added at the end.
No, absolutely. And it's definitely not something to be ignored. So, we've had those debates, like, should you say to a student, you absolutely cannot and must not use ChatGPT, for example, for this assessment? And I think that is just sticking your head in the sand. The students are using it. They're going to use it anyway. They're going to be more tech savvy. When they go out and end up working in the world, they will be using it and might even be required to use it for certain circumstances.
Exactly.
Might be told not to use it for other circumstances. So we're not doing them any favors by saying you cannot and must not use this. So I think that we've struggled a little bit with that in translation studies, whether or not students should be allowed to use machine translation for assignments. It's a tricky question, but I think we need to be quite open to the fact that these technologies are going to be all pervasive, and there's no point in us saying, no, you need to learn how to translate from scratch with no tools, no technology. That's my stance on it.
Exactly. I agree with you. So just to round it up, something about future directions. What would you say are the studies that would be mostly needed about this, and also our approaches and methods that we have used, especially in cognitive translation studies so far? Are they appropriate? Do we need some new methods, new approaches to tackle? Because these are very complex issues now, very complex phenomena.
Yeah, so in my interest in this topic, I have spoken to some of my colleagues who work in engineering and computing and who do some research on augmented cognition. And the methods that they use are, they're, in some cases we have been using them in translation studies, like eye tracking, for example. But when they want to detect cognitive states, they use a lot of tools and technologies. So they use the the hats that detect what's going on in the brain. They have galvanic skin response. Sometimes they have heart rate monitors and eye tracking. So that's a lot of stuff to put on a person for research purposes. What's interesting is it seems that once you can measure these channels, at some point you can maybe narrow it down to where one particular channel is probably a good indicator of a cognitive effort. Maybe eye tracking, maybe galvanic skin response. So in terms of development in the future, I think we are going to have to collaborate with cognitive scientists to figure out how would this work in a translation setting. And it might require some very obtrusive lab type experiments initially, but then we could probably move to having experiments that have less interventions, and some of the things that we've already been using, like eye tracking. I'm not sure about keyboard logging, whether that's really going to be a tool that we could use for sensing in such a way. I think it's more to do with the neurological and biological indicators. So I think if we were, as a research community, to move forward, we would need to be collaborating interdisciplinary with interdisciplinary colleagues on this. So for me, that would be the way forward. And then who knows where it's going to go after that. But if we don't do it in research, I think that we'll see it being done and developed in commercial systems. So we probably want to have voice in all of that, so that we don't repeat this thing where things are developed on our behalf without us actually having any say in what is developed.
Yes, exactly. Well, thank you very much, Sharon. This has been most interesting. And I hope we'll have another chance to talk about these issues in another episode of Minds Between Languages. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation as well.